Good morning, everyone. I will not reread the title of my long presentation. Thank you, Sari. But anyways, yes, I've titled it Our Journey Down the River. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from and living upon the unceded tradition and territory of the Comox First Nation. They are the traditional keepers of this land, and I am a grateful guest on their territory. My name is Kirsten, and I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm of Scottish settler ancestry. My background has been in nursing, in emergency departments, and in remote communities for the last 10 years. So this is an outline of what I'd like to share with you today about my scoping review protocol that I wrote as my culminating report. First, I'll give you some background about the organization and the project itself. Second, I'll talk about the methodology we chose to use to approach what is conventionally a very academic process. And third, how community was integral to this. And fourth and last, I will briefly discuss some of our lessons learned and the next steps for this project. So project background. I was lucky enough to complete my practicum and culminating project with CAN, Communities, Alliances and Networks, formerly Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, under the supervision of Renee Mashing, Research Impact Leader, and under the guidance of Emily Booker and Carrie Martin, who are leading this project. CAN is an Indigenous-led nonprofit organization whose research and program focus began as HIV and AIDS and has since grown to include other SDBBIs and health concerns that inequitably impact Indigenous people in Canada. CAN is the lead organization on a 5-year international project that aims to explore and respond to the sexual and reproductive health and rights of Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people living with HIV. The 7 countries partnering in this international project are Canada, Guatemala, India, Nepal, New Zealand, Nigeria, and Peru. The graphic on the right is something I created for the Canadian Community Advisory Council to help us visualize the stages of this project together. I used a river metaphor to reflect flow and the feminine nature of water. Twists and turns in the river show that the direction of the flow is always subject to changes in the landscape, weather, and seasons. The project ends at the mouth of the river to represent new beginnings from knowledge gathered during the project, while offering the opportunity for ripples, waves, and tides in bigger bodies of water. The big arrow pointing to our current phase of the project is pointing to our current phase of the project, which is the scoping review. This will be carried out separately by each country with the goal of understanding the current state of sexual and reproductive health and rights for women and girls, gender inclusive, living it with HIV in each country. And findings from the scoping review will inform future phases along this river. I was asked to create a protocol for the Canadian scoping review, which is what I will share with you for the remainder of this project or this presentation. So methodology. Indigenous scholar Margaret Kovac describes a research methodology as the thinking and doing of research. As we know, by nature, a scoping review is rooted in a Western science approach to gathering information. So applying two-eyed seeing to this process means the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, skills, values, and ultimately worldview throughout. Doing research in a good way centers an Indigenous worldview, honoring relationships, collaboration, and reciprocity over the Western-centric pursuit of results, acknowledging that the process is just as important, if not more important, than the products. To do this, a relationship with the Canadian Community Advisory Council will be centered throughout, ensuring that their voices and lived and living experience are prioritized. Aligning our scoping review with the principles of community-based research is unconventional, but essential to doing research in a good way. A post-colonial feminist lens guided those of us on the project who are of white settler ancestry. We used the most recent JBI scoping review approach by Peters and colleagues, and we wove the final step of consultation through each of the preceding 9 steps. I tried to capture our methodology in this graphic, showing an overarching two-eyed seeing approach, consultation down the river, implementation of feedback back up the river through the principles of community-based research, and all of it underpinned by a dedication to research done in a good way. The Canadian research team is advised by a group of Indigenous community members with lived and living experience and who possess a wide array and depth of wisdoms. The project is supported by an elder who participates in the Community Advisory Council meetings and opens and closes meetings to begin and end in a good way. Members were central in highlighting the importance of language to be used in the search terms and search strings from the beginning. Ultimately, this will produce a scoping review that is actually reflective of the lived and living experience of Indigenous community members living with HIV. Their feedback in the scoping review process will direct the flow of the river, and they will be centrally involved in the meaning making of the evidence in the final stages of the scoping review. Lastly, they encouraged us to always acknowledge ancestors and those who came before us in HIV advocacy, understanding that we are all standing on their shoulders as we do this work. Lastly, a few members were involved in editing my final scoping review protocol, and their feedback around language and structure has been invaluable in strengthening it as a document representative of our process together. These are just a few of the ways that members have contributed to the scoping review protocol so far. And on the right is a screenshot of the Prezi that I created as an interactive map of our journey down the river together that we used in various meetings. So finally, implications. Because of a tight project timeline, we were already working on the scoping review as I was writing the protocol. And this posed some challenges, but it also provided a lot of opportunities for the team to discuss and reorient and flow with the twists and turns of the process. Some lessons that we learned. On an international project level, developing cohesive and reproducible steps guiding a scoping review is a real challenge, given the diversity of Indigenous identity, gender identity, language, and context globally. Using a uniform international search terms and identical approaches would have meant losing this diversity while risking stifling the Indigenous ways of knowing and doing unique to each country. Also, language is so important, as we know. Indigenous terminology specific to each country must be used to capture the diversity of the Indigenous experience in each country. And finally, next steps. As I mentioned, the community or the council members will be involved in the meeting making of the scoping review results during its final stages. And from here, questions will be developed for the next phase of the project, which will be sharing circles. So while this isn't the mouth of the river for the project as a whole, it's my hope that our unconventional approach to this scoping review will also create ripples, waves, and tides in larger bodies of academic research that is truly dedicated to Indigenous community and research done in a good way. Thanks so much for listening to me.